From there, Jesus and his followers went through Galilee, but he didn't want anyone to know it. This was because he was teaching his disciples. The human one will be delivered into human hands. They will kill him. 3 days after he is killed, he will rise up. But they didn't understand this kind of talk, and they were afraid to ask him. They entered Capernaum, and when they had come into a house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about during the journey?" They didn't respond, since on the way they had been debating with each other about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be least of all and the servant of all." Jesus reached for a little child, placed him among the 12, and embraced him. Then he said, "Whoever welcomes one of these children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me isn't actually welcoming me, but rather the one who sent me." This ends the reading.
So a priest, a rabbi, and a pastor walk into a bar. I'm just kidding. As I begin today, I'm reminded of the song, and I'm at lost. I didn't look up who the singer was. I want to say it was from the 60s or 70s. It was called "The Sound of Silence." Are you familiar with that song? Help me out with it. Was it the Byrds? It was Paul Simon. Paul Simon. Thank you. Simon and Garfunkel? Simon and Garfunkel. Okay, "The Sound of Silence." And I've always mused over that through the years. Like, what is the sound of silence? Isn't silence the absence of sound? What's the sound of silence? That's something for us to ponder today as we think about this text. And there's a reason I'm thinking about silence today. I'm going to begin, though. We'll put that on a hook up the side. We'll get back to that. But when I'm called to a gravesite to offer the final words of committal, I often use the famous words of wisdom that we know so well from Ecclesiastes. There's a season for everything, a time for every matter under the heavens. The author continues this: a time for giving birth and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting what was planted, a time for crying and a time for laughing, a time for mourning and a time for dancing, a time for embracing and a time to avoid embrace. And these are but some of the complementary opposites that Ecclesiastes offers us, and I'm sure there's a multitude of ways to apply these to our lives in any given day. But there's one more pairing that really seems to frame our marking text for today. The author says, there's a time for speaking and a time to keep silent. Time for speaking and a time to keep silent. Now, as this text indicates, there are many occasions when it's appropriate to speak. When we want to express an opinion, for example, or if we want to deepen a relationship or take part in a conversation, when we feel the need to offer sympathy or encouragement or kindness to someone who's struggling. These are all occasions to speak. But there are times when it's prudent to be silent. Silence is golden when we're clueless about what's being discussed, or when all we can muster are words of hate, or words that would just be destructive to the other person. It's appropriate to keep silent when there's a palatable sense of pain in the air, such pain that any word would seem shallow, or hollow, or irrelevant. Times when only a ministry of presence is called for. But here's the thing. It's not always easy to know the difference. It's not always easy to know when to keep silent and when to speak. Believe me, I know. You guys are laughing already. Sometimes we talk too much and try to dominate the situation. And you're going to laugh at my next line I have in my notes here. Those of you who know me are laughing a little bit right now because it describes me to a T. Anyway, there are many occasions when we speak when we shouldn't. But there are also times when we keep silent when we shouldn't. For example, sometimes we're silent when faced with injustice, especially when it's directed towards someone else, towards the other who's not like me, towards the person who has a different race or nationality or tribe or sexual orientation or gender identity. They're different from me, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And sometimes we hesitate when we're faced with someone who's grieving or struggling with mental or physical or spiritual illness. We have trouble finding the right words, so we say nothing at all. And I understand it can be difficult to know when to speak and when to keep silent. And that's the underlying challenge that this text lays before us today. As Mark describes this interaction between Jesus and his inner circle, remember, this is not a wide crowd of people. He's called the 12 to himself. So as he's speaking to the 12, he indicates that twice the disciples were silent instead of responding to what Jesus was saying. Their first silence comes after Jesus once again foretells his death and resurrection. In the passage, Mark writes, they didn't understand this kind of talk, and they were afraid to ask him. But why were they afraid? Well, perhaps they didn't ask the question because they didn't want to know the answer. And they didn't want to know the answer because of how it might also affect them. I mean, when Jesus said, I'll be strung up on a cross and die a long and painful death, do you think the disciples heard the next part about being resurrected in 3 days? They probably thought that his closest friends, that those 12 around him, would be hanging there right next to him. And even if we give them the benefit of the doubt, and they did believe Jesus would be resurrected, crucifixion probably wouldn't have been very appealing. So the first silence was about self-preservation. But the second is a bit more dodgy. The second silence comes after Jesus asks them what they were arguing about. This one kind of reminds me of the kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar. They had been arguing about which one of them would be greatest. In Matthew's text, he expands this out a little bit more and who's going to sit at the left hand and the right hand of Jesus in eternity. And in the immortal words of Randy Moss, come on, man. It's hard to imagine that by this point in time, the disciples could have had such a narrow view of Jesus and his mission. But here we are. It turns out that the disciples, that those Jesus had chosen to be nearest to him, were human after all. Human beings complete with all the shortcomings and flaws that we all have. The disciples were silent when they should have spoken up because they feared death and because they were self-centered. But here's the next thing. Out of their silence, a teaching moment is here for us. So what do I mean by that? Well, remember that 3-point calling. Say no to ourselves, take up the cross, and follow in God's ways. Well, here we are. Say no to yourself. Say no to that self-centered or egotistical lesson learned by arguing about who's the greatest. Take up your cross. That's an acceptance not only of Jesus' death, but his resurrection, and how resurrection takes place in our lives each and every day. And following God's ways, I think that's our nugget for today. It must have been enlightening for the disciples when they realized that even in their silence, Jesus somehow knew what they were saying and thinking and feeling. And in the same way, it's reassuring for us that God is present in our words and our thoughts and our emotions. And when we're at a loss for words, and when we find ourselves unable to speak, God speaks for us and to us. God offers us an invitation to follow in God's ways. How? Whoever wants to be first must be least of all and a servant of all. Then he reached for a child and placed him among the 12 and said, "Whoever welcomes one of these children in my name welcomes God." My friends, the gospel is radically inclusive. All people, all human beings, with all of our flaws and idiosyncrasies, with our egos and our tendency toward self-centeredness, we're all created in the likeness and image of God. All people. Not just some, not just those who look and act and pray like we do, but all people are God's children. And whoever welcomes one of these children, God's children, into God's grace, whoever invites the forgotten, the lonely, the one who's on the outside looking in, the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor, the hungry one, whoever invites all of these people in to take part in this wonderful thing that we call church, whoever welcomes all in God's name, welcomes God, the very Spirit of the living God, into the mix. And isn't that finally something to be thankful for today? Isn't it something we should cause us not only to speak out, but to shout from the rooftops? And isn't this what healing, authentic, lasting wholeness for our nation and for the planet isn't this finally where it all begins? May healing begin with us, and may it spread in an ever-widening circle as we say no to ourselves, to our own desires and our own self-centeredness, and as we take up our cross, and as we follow in God's ways. May it be so. Amen. Amen.